Welcome to CXO Spotlight, powered by Flywheeler. I am your host, Chirag Khanija. Today's guest is Marc Levine, CEO of MetricStream. Marc has spent over a decade at Moody's Analytics, where he took over the structured finance division from a small to medium-sized business to a market leader. And 8 months ago, he was brought in at MetricStream to do the same for MetricStream. For those not familiar with MetricStream, operates in the GRC space, governance, risk, and compliance. It's how enterprise manage their regulatory requirements, avoid fines, and handle everything from cyber to ESG. And this market is growing super fast, about $60 billion already, and expected to hit $100 billion by 2030. That's compounded annual growth of around 13% every year. And MetricStream has been one of the OGs for last 20 years working in this field and having more than 1 million GRC professionals globally. So here's why this matters today, and why we are having this conversation. We're living in a world which is very, risk prone and is changing at every level. We see geopolitical, technological, regulatory, and so many of the changes happening. So GRC has become sort of the most strategic areas in the enterprise technology space. And that's why we want to have this conversation with Marc on the future of GRC. So Marc, welcome to the show. How are you doing today?
Good. Thank you for having me. Excited to have a chance to participate here.
Awesome, Marc. Well, first things first, Marc, you've been the CEO for 8 months now. Take me back to day one. What did you walk into? And then fast forward to today. What have you built or changed in this 8 months?
So as you mentioned, I joined MetricStream after having spent about a decade at Moody's. And prior to that, I worked in a smaller company that Moody's acquired, both in the structured finance space. So, when I walked in on day one at MetricStream, it was actually pretty interesting because it was right during our what we call our sales kickoff. So we had a pretty much, decent portion of the company together at an offsite. So I got to quickly meet lots of people. I would say that it was, really a situation where I tried to hit the ground running on day one. We, there's a lot going on with the company. And so I guess for me, it was definitely a bit of an adjustment going from, running a division at a large public company to going back to more, small to mid-sized business, privately owned. But it's been a really, I think, satisfying journey over the first 8 months of my time here.
Yeah. Quick follow-up. Coming in from structured finance into GRC, right? Was there anything that surprised you about the governance, risk, and compliance business or MetricStream per se?
There was a lot. I mean, I would say one of the things that I'm still kind of pretty surprised, I don't want to say surprised, it's a good thing, but when I was in the structured finance business, it was very, very niche. So there really weren't a huge number of companies that we could sell our software and data to.
Mhm.
It was, kind of very specific, banks, non-bank financials who were doing securitizations or, let's say, investors in those deals. And it was a finite universe. And one of the things that I think is really interesting about GRC is there's practically no limit to the type of company that would, interested in what we offer and have a need in and around what we offer. And it could go from a number of different verticals, whether it's banking and financial services or healthcare or pharma, mining, you name it. And so it's been really a very different experience to see that there's so many of these companies that we can, offer solutions to. So that was certainly one thing that struck me as a big change.
Interesting. And I think that's what I wanted to talk a little bit more about for the uninitiated, a lot of people who do not perhaps understand the GRC market that well, right? How about we talk from your seat as the CEO of MetricStream? When you look at the GRC landscape today, what does it actually look like? The market size, which industries are driving more demand, and who are the real buyers that are making these choices? Like, is it the chief compliance officer, risk officer? Who is the main target buyer? Give us a little bit of rundown on the industry, if you will.
Sure. I mean, maybe to take a little bit of a step back, when we talk about GRC, it really breaks down into a few different areas. And each of those areas can have different buyers within a particular organization, and there's different needs. A lot of times they're related, but they're slightly different. So to again sort of break it down, I think about it as, first of all, risk, right? So there's organizations that, and typically in this case, the chief risk officer is somebody we would sell into, that are focused on, operational risk for the company, right? So what are the, key risks? What are the controls? What's the business continuity plan for the organization, right? So there's that whole risk segment. Then there's the compliance aspect of it, right? Where now you're talking to more of like a chief compliance officer. So those are things like, what are some of the regulations that impact an organization? How are you complying with those regulations? And then, what changes are happening, right? So one of the challenges that professionals face today is there's so many different types of regulations out there, and they can be different for different industries, and trying to keep track of those regulations and making sure that you adhere to that is important. So there's the compliance, and along with the compliance are, what are your organization's policies and so on. And another aspect to GRC is really the internal audit function.
Mhm.
you know, we call it, in this space, sort of the third line of defense, but that's where, companies are concerned with things like SOX compliance, and then auditing the controls that are in place with the organization. And so you've got a separate group that may be, may be interested there. And then finally, and this sort of relates to the first area on risk, but it's everything to do with cyber, right? Where you've got a CISO that typically it is the primary buyer, and they're interested in things like, what are the cyber risks? What are the controls around that? How are you making sure that have the right protections in place against various vulnerabilities? What are the risks that your third party vendors bring to the table? So within each of those areas, or I should say, GRC sort of encompasses all of those different areas, and there's different buyers in each of those. So, size wise, I mean, you talked a little bit about the size of the market. We're definitely seeing a lot of growth in the market. I think that the numbers I typically see are something like 13 to 14%,
Mhm.
uh, annual growth. It's a market that is also, by industry. Well, I should say there's different levels of maturity by industry. We certainly see a lot in the banking and the financial services space. That's probably our biggest segment today. But there's also lots of growth in, again, manufacturing and oil and gas and other areas. So that's a little bit about the state of the market.
And why do you think there is this kind of growth? I mean, this is a significant growth. A compounded annual growth of 13% is no lean feat, right? What's driving this growth in the GRC market? What's your point of view?
I think, first of all, the world is, and this sounds very cliche, but we are at a point where there's probably more risks on businesses than has ever been the case, right? I mean, you mentioned some at the beginning. There's geopolitical risk. There's the general operational risk. One of the big things that people are focused on now is, and we're going to talk more about AI, but what are the risks that AI bring to the organization? And so I think one of the shifts that you see is it's become very much a board level topic for organizations. I can relate back to my time at Moody's, where when I first joined, or when we were first acquired, we didn't really have a very mature risk management program. And by the time I left, it was much more mature, where it was a board mandate to make sure you had a dedicated risk person within each of the business units. And that's, one example of a company. And I think where it used to be that GRC was more of a check the box exercise, I think
Yeah.
a lot of companies are realizing that it's very much a key component as to how you run a business. So when you add in, the increasing risks and new risks, you add in all the different regulations that are going on across the world, really different in different industries. You add in the increased focus by boards of directors, and that's just leading to, pretty significant growth. So I think it's a combination of those factors.
Very curious about one thing. I don't know where I heard this recently. I think there was a seesaw on the podcast earlier when we were talking about the buying experience of a chief information security officer is very much like an insurance. Insurance almost till date does their advertisements with fear, like, hey, if you will lose your life, what will happen to people you leave behind, right? A lot of buying for risk and compliance is done with fear motivation, right? Not with innovation motivation like other enterprise technology. And when I see a lot of sanctions, geopolitical changes, and being very volatile, like you need to keep up with these things, as well as when I see AI bringing so many threat vectors, I kind of think that that also leads the board and the CXO level chamber to start thinking about this very, very seriously. Do you kind of, does that resonate with you? Yeah.
I think there's an aspect of that for sure. I mean, I would say that it's a situation where there are legitimate reasons why you in today's world have a lot more. You need to put a lot more focus on things. Like, just use an example of third party risk. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, an issue that you might have had at a supplier, like let's say that they have a data breach or some issue, right? The likelihood of that then impacting your business was a lot less than what it is today. And now with everything fully interconnected, there's a reality out there, which is to say that if you are relying on third parties, you do need to monitor them. You do need to understand the risk associated with it, because not only could it have an isolated risk in as it relates to their system, but then what happens to your customers. And so I think there's a little bit of that, quote unquote fear, but I think a lot of it is warranted based upon just the reality of the world that we live in.
So, yeah. All right. Moving on. I'm very interested to talk about this, which is AI. Talk of every topic, talk of every discussion. You launched an AI first strategy within months of joining, not like add some AI features. You said AI first. So, where does AI naturally fit into GRC workflows, and why is this the moment for that strategy?
So first, let me talk about it from the standpoint of just sort of our internal use of AI. I mean, and I'm sure a lot of companies are doing similar things, but one of the real commitments we've made as a company is to leverage AI tools to really allow us to roll out features much, much faster and capabilities much, much faster than we ever could, and also do more to support our customers. So in addition to the things that we're putting into our product, um, a lot of our people, most of our people internally are very, very much, moving their ways of working to much more of an AI first, uh, if you will, culture. And that's been a real big win for the company. Now, when it comes to the product itself, I think we think about it from a couple different perspectives. So one thing about one thing about GRC is that companies particularly large, enterprise, major type companies, they, and this is part of the reason they come to a company like MetricStream, they have their own ways of working, meaning when you're implementing, let's say, a risk management program, there's certain data elements you want to capture. There's certain controls that you have in place, and there's workflows that you want to have. So if something happens here, how do you trigger it now? And so we at MetricStream have historically had ways to really custom tailor that for organizations. But a fundamental shift we've made is to make the configurability of those, call it workflow changes, form changes, be done through artificial intelligence. So where before making those types of changes would require somebody to go into a configuration engine or an app studio or something along those lines, now introduce the like a chat interface that gives the context and makes those changes much faster and easier to do. Now, beyond that, and this is where I think things get pretty exciting. We're looking at AI across all the different workflows that our system provides. So in the world of GRC, historically, there's been a lot of manual work that people have to do. For example, you're going through an audit, these audit work papers, and then you got to fill out forms. Today, the whole aspect or the whole process of getting data from those forms and bringing it into the system and filling them out can be fully automated. So you're saving organizations massive amounts of time. Things like, regulatory changes, right? Again, there's always been, I shouldn't say always, but over the last, whatever, 5-10 years, there's been ways that you can bring in information on, what's changing from a regulatory perspective, but the amount of information becomes pretty significant. And what we've started to do is to say, um, you know, use AI to bring that into context and just focus on those things that really relate to, what you're doing in your particular program. So those are some examples, and workflows themselves. I mean, one of the things I think that's pretty cool about MetricStream is because we have this concept of integrated GRC, as we're building agents, our risk agent can talk to our third-party risk agent, right? So back to my earlier example, if a vendor has a breach, well, that agent can sort of pick that up and then trigger another workflow with the risk agent, from an operational risk perspective. And before AI, that would be a fully sort of manual process where you'd have to have individuals, kind of talking through this. I'm not saying that they don't, but that whole process can now be fully automated through these AI agents. So it's really exciting. And then not to mention the insights that it provides, right? So, again, one of the challenges historically with GRC is that the professionals in the space would spend a lot of time collecting data, filling out forms, maybe there's some dashboards, but what is the actionable information that data is telling you? With AI and with, the things that we're doing, for example, at MetricStream, that can all be automated through the AI capacity and agents that we offer.
And I think that's very interesting to me because when I think about GRC, the way you are explaining it right now is that there's a bit of listening that you need to be always up to date on what changes are happening and what regulations and what compliance changes are happening. And then you need to be able to correlate that to what it means for that business, right? For your end client, and be able to fire up workflows and paperwork and things like that. So I almost see what you said, AI fitting into all of these places, all the way from listening to the insights that they use. So it's pretty, it's impacting almost the full stack here, right?
Absolutely. And I think the other thing that is important to understand. And we talk to our clients about this a lot. They'll say, oh, well, some of this stuff, doesn't ChatGPT do that, or whatever the case may be. And again, we're not in the business of creating LLMs. What we bring to the table is the context, right? So it's all of the relevant controls, and how those controls map to risks, and how that maps to the business processes that organizations have and the assets. All of that context lives within our system. And so by then layering the AI, the LLMs on there with the very specific context that exists within our system, those agents and the AI in general can behave with a lot more accuracy, right? And that's the thing about AI, as we all know, is that there's a danger with AI hallucinating. And what really makes all the difference in the world is the accuracy of the data, and the context that you can provide to it. So the more it has, the more accurate it's going to be, and then the better able it is to really provide value to businesses.
Yeah, this was super interesting to me. This is my world. Like what you just spoke about is my world. Like I'm building brand story AI. We are associated with Microsoft, and what you said resonates with me so much because even though AI is so widespread, and we would think everybody understands the difference between a vertical AI versus ChatGPT, like you would wish that all of your customers understand the difference, but you would still that question that can ChatGPT do that? And that's what very different from what you do. But in my world, we are building a marketing and sales platform, but only for IT industry. And the problem we often tell them and that we solve is that we have the whole intelligence layer of IT industry built in there. How a CIO thinks, how a CISO thinks. So every marketing and sales content is different. Try getting that from a chat GPT. You would get, since everybody is doing using chat GPT, everybody writes the same emails, the sales messages. Try asking brand story, and you would get an answer that a CIO wants to listen to because it has context, and the world is
Yeah.
moving towards context, right? So that resonates so well with me. But
Yeah.
moving on, I want to talk about your customer. Like, let's think about a chief compliance officer, who's building out their GRC stack, risk management, compliance automation, cyber risk, third party, all those things, right? Can you tell me, like, how are they thinking about what they need today versus they used to think before? Like, you must be talking to a lot of customers. What layers um, does a buyer like this thinks about while making a decision about a platform like yours? What are they looking for?
Yeah. That's a great question. And I think a lot of it boils down to some of the stuff we've talked about already. But um, you know, when we think about those organizations, sorry, those groups within organizations, one is simplicity, right? So, you know, as GRC has evolved, and by the way, it hasn't fully evolved in all organizations, but let's say as it's evolved from a check the box exercise to one where it becomes something of a true mission critical, a business enabler, it's really important that the front line gets involved. And what I mean by that is, typically within an organization, you've got the second line, which is your risk group, but it's the business user, someone within the business that really understands the business and the business processes and the risks, that needs to make sure that the right level of information is in the system. And so simplicity, and this is a big focus for us at MetricStream with respect to how the frontline users capture data within the product or within any system, is really important. I can speak to this from the standpoint of when I was at Moody's. I was actually like I said, I ran the business, but I was also very involved in the risk program for our structured finance group. And we had to go through and we had to, enter all the risks and say, what were the right controls associated with the risks. And we had to score them and all of that. And, I won't tell you the system that we used, but it wasn't MetricStream, and it was incredibly difficult to enter that data. It took me it just spent so much time. And I remember I'd be like, this is horrible. So if you're going to get if you're going to get business people to use a system, you got to make it something that they can easily navigate and enter the data through. So that's a big focus area for people or for kind of the buyers of these types of systems. And the second thing is, again, the intelligence layer. As we talk about, the data is one thing, but then it's the so what. So what do you actually, what does it mean? How do you use that to better manage a business? And so, what I think is really important is that, companies or vendors like a MetricStream provide that intelligence layer to help the business. And, the second line, third line really makes sense of this information, right? And help focus in on or hone in on the areas that do represent the biggest risk. So that's a second thing that we see them looking for. Automation is huge. The things like these agents, things like monitoring controls on a continuous basis, collecting evidence in an automated fashion. Those are now those are things that are really really important to organizations. Another theme that we see that's important is the quantification of risks, right? Boards and businesses think in terms of dollars and what is the real impact of this particular risk if it were to come to fruition. So things like cyber risk quantification, are typically front and center, with buyers. So those are some of the things that sort of come to mind for me.
Cool. I'll tell you, I think it's a tough question that I'm going to ask, but I think it's important because it's about the one is that rational choices that you mentioned, right? What's the rationality behind how will I decide about a platform? The other one is the choices available to them. And here's what I'm seeing across the enterprise software as a whole, right? Companies used to buy everything from, let's say, one vendor. If I have a enterprise license agreement with SAP, you know what? GRC get rolled up into that. If I have a contract with IBM or ServiceNow, some of the extra freebies or extra licenses used to go with that. But now,
Yeah.
now the buyer is getting more selective, and I'm hearing the same thing happen with the GRC as well. Why do you think enterprises are moving away from one vendor does it all for them and being more selective about specialty providers for the special need? Are you also seeing that, first of all?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we have, we have situations where clients use us for one thing and some of our competitors for for others, and also the systems sort of talk to each other. I think I'll give you a broad statement. I mean, my observation from being in the space is that there's definitely a lot of vendors out there who are solid vendors, right? And there's not always it's not always an easy decision, I think, for buyers to say, hey, why are we going to choose this particular product versus this product? A lot of times the features might look similar. I think it comes down to a few things, right? Well, first let me answer your first question in terms of why why are they more willing to go with multiple systems. I think just the ease of integration today is a lot, it's a lot simpler to integrate multiple systems, whereas before it's probably, a bit more complicated. So I think that opens up the world to people in terms of making those types of decisions. I think the second thing is you've got, different buyers within the organization that have different sets of needs, right? So some of the players in the GRC space are really good in, let's say, audit, whereas others are, their real strength is operational risk, and others it's cyber. And so I think you've got, different buyers that are going to try to make those decisions based on the best in class product for their particular need. But even when it comes down to that, I still think, organizations will sometimes struggle with, what choice do we make, right? Why do we go with a MetricStream versus, an IBM or whatever the case may be? I think a lot of times also though, and again, maybe this sounds cliche, but a lot of times it comes down to comfort with the organization. I think, at the end of the day, I've said this throughout my career, people buy from people. And I think, every system has, their strengths in terms of features, but what I think is important to a lot of buyers still is, who do we feel comfortable working with? If there's that inevitable problem in the implementation, or we have a problem, with the product at, midnight, who's the vendor that we feel, is going to be there to serve us best. I think those are some of the things that go into the decision making process.
All right, I'm going to ask you something very interesting, and you're going to love this because this think of a chief compliance officer or a chief risk officer listening to this episode, right? And let's think they're evaluating GRC vendors right now. What questions should they be asking that they're not asking today, and which would separate a surface level evaluation from actually understanding that they're making the right choice?
Great question. One would be really drilling into the ability for the system to adapt to the way that they do business. A lot of times, you look at a demo and on the surface it looks great, but then when you actually go to do the implementation, you realize that it's not so easy to make it, work for you. So that's one thing is I would caution anybody to really, get under the covers and drill into that. The second thing is I would really, when it comes to AI, I would really strongly suggest that companies drill into the specifics of the AI use cases that can be brought to the table. It's so easy to just use that word of AI, but the real question is what is the business value that this particular vendor or that particular vendor is going to bring to the table with a given AI use case. Another thing I would ask is really drilling into the level of capability within each of the specific areas. Again, GRC can be a very, very broad term. And if a company is interested in solving, let's say, an op risk and a cyber and a compliance, you know, problem, let's say, or business requirement, really, really drilling in and understanding the the details of that and what can be offered is absolutely critical.
Yeah, I think very interesting. And that segues into something I wanted to ask you because when I read and did research about this, right, I heard about you doubling down on AI, right? And it is strategic from the perspective of AI first as an approach, not like a bolted on AI strategy. I like that. But at the same time, I think um, you must be thinking something 2, 3 years down the line when you're doing this. Because you have a gut feel where the market is going. And I think I'm seeing some of that pattern. So here's my question that, when AI is forcing a lot of platforms to be reevaluated. It's a great opportunity for a company that is saying, I'm AI first, because you have everything is working fine. I am never going to replace that. But now I'm being asked by my leadership that, hey, do more with less. Does your platform have AI, insight, instant answer, contextual capability? And suddenly I'm like, oh, does our GRC Play platform have AI or not? Or is there any other platform, right? So who do you believe, what would separate in 2, 3 years down the line between the companies in the space that win versus some of the companies that probably are not evolving at that speed?
I think it's going to be around the ability to continue to um, evolve and adapt the use cases. What we find a lot of times is when we contemplate something that we're going to put into the system, let's say for an AI use case, what we initially roll out isn't isn't necessarily where it lands, right? So in other words, you have sort of a hypothesis that says, okay, if we inject AI into this phase of the business process and it can do these things, then it will add value. And then what will happen sometimes is, you go and you spend time with the customers and you realize like, well, it's kind of right. You got it about 70% of the way there, but you gotta tweak it. And I think I think the vendors that will be successful are the ones that continue to take the time to sit with their customers, really forward engineer those use cases that are going to bring the most value, and then really, really, really focus on those. Because again, it's AI for the sake of AI. Or it's almost like a feature for the sake of a feature, right? Like sometimes software companies will just roll out a feature and it looks really cool, but in practice, is anybody really going to get value out of it? So I think that'll be the biggest difference between the winners and the losers is how connected you are with the customer base, and where you can most add value. I also think, it's pretty interesting. I'm sure you're seeing this in your other conversations. I mean, I don't think we're at a point where, people are comfortable just leaving AI on its own, right? It's much more of an augmentation play right now where, you're still gonna check and validate and I think we're gonna be in that spot for quite a while. But ultimately, um, the companies that really continue to enhance their context so that the level of um, accuracy that the AI produces is one that people can trust more and more, that'll also help, because you have the greatest feature, but if you don't have that right context, that you don't have the ability to get people comfortable that it's going to be right, then you're not really saving time, because they're already, they're spending all their time, checking the work of the AI.
Yeah, well said, well said. My last question is on for MetricStream, right? And my question is that from my vantage point, I can see a couple of things being very good about your strategy. One is, of course, the understanding of the industry of 20 years. That's very hard to replicate in my eyes, right? Because you understand the industry, being the OG in this industry, then is your AI bet. But I'm not you. From your vantage point, what do you think MetricStream has that's genuinely difficult for any competitor to replicate? And how are you like strategically positioned with that?
So that is an excellent question. And I would say there's a few things. One, as you said, I mean, we've been at this for a lot of years, and we've had multiple iterations of our platform and our systems. And by definition, that means we've learned a lot of lessons over the years. I think you will not find another company that is as feature rich as what already exists at MetricStream. It would take a substantial amount of time to rebuild what exists here. So in the core platform itself, is just capabilities that have taken decades to build. Secondly, there's the inherent knowledge of people within the organization. Again, I said this before, people do buy from people. And what you have within MetricStream is just literally hundreds of people that have done collectively thousands of implementations for companies. And you can't, that's really hard to replace, because when you, let's say you're a buyer and you go with a system, you want to be working with a vendor that has the experience of having, done this at XYZ other company and set it up right. So I think that's a huge thing for any other, vendor to try to replicate. And then again, when it comes to AI, in the context, I mean, we've got years of context around, the control to risk to, process to asset, that whole model being built into the system. So I feel, look, again, I've said this, there's a lot of great vendors out there. But the level of experience, the level of depth of our platform, the level of configurability to meet business requirements, and solve really difficult problems, it's hard to build that out over, a short period of time. And I just think, that's where we shine, is when organizations, have some of those challenges and that they're not easy to solve. We can come in and do that.
Awesome. That was perfect. That's all I had, Mark, and thank you so much for joining today. This was such a wonderful conversation. Thank you for everyone watching, whether you are a chief compliance officer or a chief risk officer or CISO, evaluating GRC platforms, or trying to understand this market, or someone who just learned what GRC is today. If this changed the way how you think about governance, risk, and compliance, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And you'll find details for Mark and MetricStream in the record below. And you'll find the details for CXO Spotlight as well. Thank you for watching CXO Spotlight.